Welcome back to our Sunday school class here at Pittsburgh Free Will Baptist Church. I'm your host, Brad Goodley. We took a week off, so we're going to kind of review here a little bit. What we were talking about the last time were the feast and the harvest cycles that go along with the feast. Okay, and here's an example of all the things that are harvested in Israel at the time of the feast. We talked about Passover unleavened bread first fruits. That's barley harvest. Pentecost is wheat harvest. Trumpets is the grape harvest, and Day of Atonement, that would be the olive harvest. We're not going to get to the grapes and the olives or the wheat. We're going to talk about the barley because that has to do with us Gentiles. So we're going to look at that today and the fullness of the Gentile, what that verse actually means. So the barley harvest, that's the Gentiles, and the first fruits of the Jewish people who are believers in Jesus, the Messianic Jews. And then the wheat harvest would be the rest of the believers in the tribulation. The grape harvest would be the remnant of whoever was left at the end. And then the olive harvest would be the 144,000. We're not going to get to all that. That's where we're going to go in the future. But we're going to look at the Gentiles and the fullness of the Gentiles and what that has to do with the barley harvest, because it has to do with us. So the first fruit of the barley harvest, like we talked about last time, was the saints that came out of the graves with Jesus, okay? The ones that went up with him in Acts, the cloud that received him out of sight, that was the first fruits of the barley harvest. And they were presented by the Son of Man in Daniel, that's Jesus, with the clouds, that's the first fruits, that's the believers that came out of the graves, to the Ancient of Days, that's Father God. Okay, so it's a perfect example of what Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits is a spiritual representation of a physical act. Okay, and that's why God had them do the feast. And this would be the priest. He would go out, take the first fruits of the barley harvest, and wave it before God in the temple. And that's exactly what Jesus did with those first fruits that came out of the grave with him. So what is Jesus waiting on right now? He's waiting on the end of the harvest, us, the fullness of the Gentiles. So there has to be a fullness of the Gentiles that come in to believing and come into the family before God harvests the barley harvest and brings it to heaven. Okay, and that again is part of the picture of the rapture. We talked about the rapture being equal to a Galilean wedding. Well, it's also equal to the barley harvest. Revelation 5:11. Tells us that when he does harvest all of us, there's going to be 10,000 times, there's going to be an innumerable host around the throne. So that's what Jesus is waiting on God to say, hey, go get your bride. So Revelation 2 through 5:14, that is basically the barley harvest. Now, Revelation 2 and 3, that's where Jesus sends out the letters to the 7 churches. Why does that have to be part of that? Well, he's trying to get his body ready, and he's waiting on us. Why hasn't he? He came to get us because we've not got ourselves ready, and that's what those letters to the 7 churches are about. There was only 2 of them that he spoke good about the whole thing. It was Smyrna and Philadelphia. Those are the only 2 that he didn't have anything bad to say about. That's about 28%. Now, if you go back to the statistic that only 15% of people that's in church actually believe in the Bible, I'd say that's a pretty good statistic of where churches are in America right now. The wheat harvest is from Revelation 4:1 to 14:16. And remember, there's a sheaf taken every day for 50 days, and then the final wheat harvest is taken. And that happens in Revelation 14:16. Then comes the grape harvest, 14:17 through 17:18. And then finally, Revelation chapter 18, that's the olive harvest. So as you can see, God goes from one to the next. I mean, that's why Jesus is called the capstone and the cornerstone. He goes from one thing to the next. Jesus is the first and the last. He does the same thing with the feast. So let's get into the fullness of the Gentiles and what that means. Romans 11:25 says, "For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery." What Paul is trying to say is, hey, this idea of bringing the Gentiles back in and them being raptured out when the fullness comes in, it's a mystery. It was in the Old Testament, but it was veiled. Why would God veil it? Well, You don't want to tell your enemy everything that you're doing. It wasn't revealed until the New Testament with Paul and the disciples, okay? But 1 Corinthians 2:8 tells us that none of the rulers of this age, if they would have known what they were doing, they wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory. So, and he's not talking about physical rulers. He's talking about the principalities, the powers, those false gods, okay? Now, we're going to get into those false gods, and were they real or were they just figments of imagination? And it has to do with the fullness of the Gentiles also. So he says, I don't want you to be ignorant of this, that you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles was brought in. This is the, chapter 11 is the verse where he talks about Israel being or God being the olive tree, and the branches being broke off, and the wild olive tree being grafted in, and that's us. And that when we become full, he's going to harvest us and regraft in Israel to do what they were supposed to do. Okay? And we're seeing that right now with all the Messianic Jews that are coming to Christ. Well, where did this separation start at between Jew and Gentile? Because when they got off the boat with Noah, there was one family. So how did it get separated into Jew and to Gentile? I'm glad you asked. It happened at the Tower of Babel. Well, where's that in the Bible? What we're going to look at, it's called the Divine Council. It's the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Now, if you ask most people, or Christians, where did all this go wrong? I mean, where did we get depravity at and all the sin and stuff? Most people would point back to the Garden of Eden, the fall of man, and that's right. That's where we stop. Well, most first and temple area Jews, when they would say, that's a little bit different than that. There's some more rebellions that happened. That God had a divine council. He had a divine family, and he wanted an earthly family. And he appointed those divine members over certain areas and certain people, and they let power corrupt them. So we're going to get into that. Where does that come from? The best source on this is Dr. Michael Heiser is his name. He's got several doctorate degrees. His main doctorate degree is in Semitic languages. And what does that mean? If you want to know what the Bible says and you want to know the culture it was in, that's the guy you go to. Usually guys like him, we don't ever read any of their writings because they're in academia and all they do is write papers and things that people there read and you can't get to them. But he saw that this was so important that he started writing books that actually people could understand. And he puts the cookies on the lower shelf. I mean, it's not hard to understand the way he writes, and it's brilliant. But what he talks about is the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, and that we lost this in around 3 AD, okay, around the 3rd century. Guys like Augustine, early church fathers, wanted to separate themselves from anything Jewish, so they stopped teaching this stuff. Well, in doing that, we lose a whole lot of translation of why the Bible says certain things, and you're going to see that today. So there was actually 4 rebellions. There wasn't just one. The first one was Satan's rebellion. He fell, Genesis 1:2. Then you had the fall of man in Genesis 3. Then you had the rebellion of the sons of God as divine council members in Genesis 6. And then they also did it again at the Tower of Babel. Okay? We're going to talk about the Tower of Babel because that has to do with the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. So let's look at that. Deuteronomy 32:8 says, when the Most High, that's God, divided their inheritance to the nations. Who's there? Well, it's the children of Israel or the sons of God. Okay, and I'll explain that in a second. So he's dividing their inheritance. He's giving their inheritance, these members of the divine council, to the nations. He's going to divide them up. And when he separated the sons of Adam, so he took man, and there were families, and they made nations, and he separated them to each one of the members of the divine council, and he set boundaries over them. So he's creating cosmic geography, is what this talks about, of peoples according to the number. And in the New Testament, in the King James Version, the New King James Version, it says children of Israel. That's not actually correct. That's a mistranslation, because the oldest known translation we have is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that wasn't until 1945, and it says the sons of God, and I'll show you that here in a little bit. What God did was take his portion, his people, the Jewish people, and he divided everybody else. So here's what happened. When they got off the boat, he told Noah, hey, I want you to be fruitful and multiply. So the families were supposed to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, just like Adam and Eve. They had a commandment to do that. Well, lo and behold, by chapter 11, they said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to build a city right here. We're all going to gather together. We're going to build a temple, which is the tower, and we're going to make you, God, come to us. And God said, I don't think so. I've had enough of you people. You don't want me to be your God? That's fine. I'm going to appoint members of my divine council over you, and I'm going to take Abram, and I'm going to take him out, and he's going to be mine, and we're going to go to where I want him. So this is the actual piece out of the Dead Sea Scrolls that translates this. It says, when the Most High divided the nations according to the numbers of the sons of Elohim. Okay, and that's the sons of God right there. And just by coincidence, it's the exact area that they found. Most of that scroll was kind of messed up, but they did find this one. It's kind of like God wanted us to know that. Psalm 2 tells us that Jesus gets all those nations back. We, the Gentiles, are his inheritance. Israel is God's inheritance. Okay? So, verse 8 says, ask of me and I will give you the nations for your inheritance. Now, think about that. Jesus didn't have to do what he did. But he did it because he loved us and he wanted to bring us back into the family because we were separated right there at the Tower of Babel. Ephesians 3:5, Paul tells us that in the ages before, this was not made known to the sons of men. Okay, it was in there, but it was veiled, and they didn't talk about it because God, again, didn't want to tell the enemy what was going on. But he revealed it to the apostles and the prophets there. Verse 6 says that the Gentiles should be fellow heirs. See, that's why the disciples didn't want to go to the Gentiles at the beginning, because they were like, hey, they got separated from us at the Tower of Babel. They're out. And what God was saying is, no, I'm bringing them back in through Jesus. Genesis 9 is when he gave the commandment to Noah to go be fruitful and multiply. Now, it doesn't say he gave him dominion. Why? Because Adam and Eve gave that dominion up to Satan. Well, he had that until Jesus died on the cross, and that's what Jesus took back for us. So we would have dominion to go be fruitful, fill the earth, and multiply, and have dominion over everything. So back to this. It's actually, this is where we lose a lot of translation of the Bible, why we don't understand certain things. Let me give you, for instance, did God just one day just say, all right, Abram, you come with me and I'm going to show you a land? No, it was after the Tower of Babel, after he divided everybody up. This is why Genesis 12 makes more sense. Now the Lord had said to Abram, it wasn't Abraham yet, get out of your country. Why did he tell him to get out of the country? Because that was no longer, he was going to turn that area over to those gods and those nations. That's what he was doing. He was dividing them up. And God said, I'm going to take you to a land I'm going to show you. The interesting thing about this is, even in the Bible, it says, God says, I will put my name on this land. When they started doing satellite photos of Israel, they found out something. His name is actually on the land. There's Jerusalem, and there is his name in the landscape right there. It's Yud, there's the Yud, Hey, there's the Hey, Vav, there's the Vav, and there's the Hey. It's in the landscape. God put it in there. That's pretty amazing. There's some other words in that too. He not only put it there, and he put it in Jerusalem. Now, when the priest would give the blessing, the Aaronic blessing, if you see me raise my hands like this, the reason why is this is the letter of Shin, it's the letter of God, okay? So they would put the name of God on you as a blessing. So that's why they would do that. Yes, that's why Star Trek did this, okay? The guy that wrote it was Jewish, and live long and prosper, okay? So you got some Star Trek trivia that you didn't know there. Anyway, but the landscape of Jerusalem is divvied up in a Shin. The Tyropoeon Valley, the Hinnon Valley, and the Kidron Valley all make up the Shin right there. So you can see that around the temple. God wasn't kidding when he said, I'm going to put my name on that. So God took Abram as his, and he divided up all the nations to the divine council. Now, they weren't bad at that time. But just like power always corrupts, it corrupted them and they started being oppressive. That's why in Psalms 82 he tells them, hey, you guys didn't do what I told you to do, and you're going to die like men. And we'll talk about that next time. But Genesis 12:2 says, I will make you a great nation. He's talking to Abram here. So he's telling him, I want to make you a great nation. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make your name great so you can be a blessing. Now here's the kicker. He divided and he separated, and he could have just left at that, but he didn't, because he loves us. And this verse right here, he says, I will bless those that bless you. I will curse him who curses you. And in all you, the families of the earth shall be blessed. What family did Jesus come out of? He came out of the Jewish family. And in that, what happened? All the families of the earth could be blessed and we could be brought back in. Okay? So God's little secret was there is I'm separating them now, but I'm not always going to keep it that way. I'm going to bring you back in. So back to that, he separated them, he set boundaries, and God said, I'm going to take Abram and we're going to go to mine. Okay? And what was Abram supposed to do? Abraham was supposed to do exactly what Adam and Eve was supposed to do, which was expand the kingdom. Okay? God doesn't have plan B. He's got plan A, and that's what he wants us to do. Same thing. Daniel 10:12 says, Then he said to me, Do not fear, Daniel, for the first day that you set your heart to understand and humble yourself before God, your words were heard, and I have come because of your words. Now what happened here is Daniel was praying because he saw all the things that was going on, and he fasted for 21 days, and he prayed. And what Gabriel's telling him there is, hey, the first day that you started to pray, I came, but I was hindered. Verse 13 says, But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me for 21 days. Now what? What that's talking about is that's not a literal prince on earth. That is one of the members of the divine council that was fighting against Gabriel so that he couldn't come there. Okay? Now, you don't understand that until you understand the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Okay? So this wasn't an actual prince on earth. This was one of the divine members that God appointed over that had become corrupt. And he was fighting Gabriel and trying to keep him from going and talking to Daniel. But Michael came. Behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left alone there with the king of Persia. Okay? So this is an example of the cosmic geography that's in the Bible. These members that God pointed over man, they fight for their territory. We need to think about that. So the fullness of the Gentiles has got to come in, and Jesus blew all that up, okay, that took the power away from them and gave it to us. And he's waiting for us to bring all the people in, and that's we got to get busy on that. Ephesians 3:7 said, Paul tells, I became a minister according to the gift of grace of God given to me by the effective working of his power. He's saying, that's what my job was to go to the Gentile and tell them, hey, you don't have to follow these gods anymore. You're not under that anymore. That separation that happened at the Tower of Babel, you don't have to do that anymore. That's what he was doing on Mars Hill when he was talking to them about the unknown God. That's basically what he was saying to them. Hey, you can come back into the family. And then he talks about that I should preach among the Gentiles the unsearchable reaches of Christ. And that's what he was doing. So it's what Paul's job was. Acts 15:14 says, Simon has declared how God at the first visited the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. We're literally called Christians, right? We're called after Jesus' name, and we're brought out of those Gentile nations. The same thing, the next verse says the same thing, even the Gentiles who are called by my name. Romans 11:17, and if some of the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive tree were grafted in among them, and with them became partakers of the root of the fatness of the olive tree. This is where he's telling us, hey, what Jesus did, because the Jewish people rejected him, they were blinded. So God grafted us in by his grace so we could get nourishment off of him, okay, through Jesus. But he also tells us, don't get too cocky about that. Well said, because unbelief they were broken off, and you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear. And what he's saying there is don't get all high and mighty about, well, they got broken off, because the same thing can happen to you. And you see that with a lot of churches these days. They're walking away from God. They're teaching their own things. Romans 11:23, and they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted back in. And we're seeing that right now with Jews all over the world being grafted back in. They're coming to the knowledge of Jesus. And then the last verse here talks about the fullness of the Gentile. When the fullness of the Gentile, that barley harvest, when all those, the number gets to wherever it's supposed to be, that's when God is going to tell his son, hey, go get your bride. Back to Psalms 2:7 says, I declare the decree, the Lord has said to me, you are my son. That's Jesus. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance. And there it is. He's telling Jesus, I'm giving you this, okay? And the last part of that verse is interesting. He says, you shall break them with a rod of iron, you shall dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. Well, where does that show up in the Bible else? It shows up in the book of Revelation in the 7 churches. And he says, him who overcomes and keeps my works until the end, what does he say? I will give him power over the nations. Why? Because we are joint heirs with Jesus, and he got as the inheritance power over the nations. So we get that same power. Now, you don't understand that verse in the book of Revelation until you understand the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Then he says in verse 27, he shall rule them with a rod of iron, and he shall dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. Exact same thing what he says in Psalms 2. And he says, I also have received from my Father. You're going to receive what I receive. So this verse in Deuteronomy 32 explains a whole lot. For instance, you had 70 nations that were divided up, and you find those in Genesis 10, okay, from Shem, Japheth, and Ham. There's 70 nations that God, so he had 70 members of the divine council, and he divided them up among the 70 nations, okay, and you'll find that in Genesis 10. So in Luke 10, if there were 70 original nations, you don't understand why Jesus sent out 70 disciples to go to the nations if you don't understand that worldview. After these things, the Lord appointed 70 others also and sent them 2 by 2 before him, before his face, into every city and place where he himself was about to go. And then he says this, then he said to them, the harvest is truly great, but the laborers are few. What is he saying? Barley harvest. Go get the barley harvest. And it's associated to what? Him sending out the 70. What he was doing was poking those 70 members of the divine council that he appointed over man that became corrupt. He's poking them in the eye and say, you're no longer got any power. These guys are going to replace you. Okay? He's poking them and trying to pick a fight with them so they'll put him on the cross and kill him. And by doing that, they actually killed themselves because he took complete power away from them. He got them to destroy themselves, which is what our enemy does to us. So Jesus sent out the 70 disciples. There were 70 original nations. Okay, so this was a signal that, hey, I'm calling back the nations to me. Baal, or Bel, had 70 sons that would come and visit him on Mount Hermon. That was one of their stories. Now, where did they get that at? From this Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Revelation 12:4 tells us that a third of the angels fell. And it gives an example of them, these angels, as stars. So the symbol of the angel would be the star. Okay? For instance, and another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great and fiery red dragon, that's Satan, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head, drew a third of the stars from heaven and threw them to earth. Okay? So that's where we get a third of the angels fell with Satan. And it tells us that in verse 9. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan. So that's who he's talking about. That he was cast out, and who was cast out with him? The angels that were with him, that were following him, and that was a third of them. Okay, so an angel is equal to a star. Does that show up anywhere else in the Bible? Yes, it does. In Revelation 1:20, the mystery of the 7 stars, it talks about Jesus having 7 stars in his right hand. And right here he's given the interpretation of that. He says these 7 stars that were in my right hand are the 7 angels of the 7 churches. So there again, angels equal stars. It's just a symbolism, okay? There's no coincidence that in Egypt, the tombs, the top of the tombs were lined with stars, 5-point stars. How many countries have stars in their flags? Occult people use stars, and why they invert them and do stuff with them. I don't want to get into all that. If you would like to know about occult symbols, you can read these 2 books from Edith Starr Miller. She wrote these in the 30s. That's a new translation of them, the new version. These are the older versions. That's what they look like. If you want to know about all the symbolism and about where all false religions, which they all come from Babylon, just what we've been talking about, these books are got an unbelievable amount of information in them. An example of this would be in our Capitol building. If you look up in the rotunda, there are pentagrams, stars with circles around them, okay? And just by coincidence, there's 70 circles with stars in them up there. I wonder why there's 70 there. I'll let you chew on that one for a while. So Revelation 17:5 says, and on her forehead the names were written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. And you don't understand that unless you understand the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, that all these false religions, a mother of harlots, anytime you had a false religion, that was deemed a harlot, okay? Because you were going away from God. If you trace all of them back, where do they go? They go right back to the Tower of Babel when God separated the Jews from the Gentiles, okay? So if you see when you start pulling on these verses and you start meshing them together and you put them in the right context, they all make sense. So what is Jesus waiting for? He's waiting for us to go do our job, which is reap the harvest. Bring in the barley harvest. So it's our job to go out and tell people the good news about Christ. Because the wheat harvest is coming. The tribulation is coming. And if you can't see these things that we've been talking about going around us, you need to wake up. Next time we'll talk about the Feast of Pentecost a little bit, because this Sunday is actually Pentecost. We'll talk about that and the Feast of Trumpets a little bit more, okay? And I'll give you an example of the last trumpet and what it will sound like. So again, that's my email. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. See you next week.